While the Fellowship stays in Lothlorien, Sam and Boromir experience critical turning points that alter their character development for the rest of the trilogy. And the most intriguing part, both of these moments are removed from the film. The book tells us about how Sam accompanies Frodo to the Mirror of Galadriel and sees his worst nightmare, which in turn builds upon the foundation for his steadfast loyalty to the mission and to Frodo. In contrast, Boromir, who so far in Tolkien's writings has had a much more gradual decline than what is shown in the movie, officially breaks and falls victim to the power of the ring. But do you know who is behind both of these events? Galadriel. So this made me think, why did Peter Jackson remove this impactful moment of Sam realizing the importance of completing their journey? And did Galadriel give Boromir the final push that caused his ultimate downfall? My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 15 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. If you're new here, this is the show where I analyze Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, scene by scene, and compare it to Tolkien's original work. Today we come upon one of the most important chapters in the entire Fellowship of the Ring book, which corresponds to two scenes in the movie. We'll take a look at everything Peter Jackson removed or changed for the films and analyze how these moments impact the overall story. Specifically, we'll talk about what exactly Sam sees in the Mirror of Galadriel that disturbs him so much. Plus, I'll reveal the final straw that broke Boromir's proverbial back, causing him to try to take the ring from Frodo just a few days afterwards. Today's episode is jam-packed with plot changes that have massive implications in Tolkien's writings. So stick around, because at the end, I want to hear your thoughts on Peter Jackson's version of these events. As always, I'll cover these changes across 4 categories, which are characters, location, timeline, and plot. But before we dive into any changes, we need to cover what happens in these scenes of Peter Jackson's film. Last week, we left off with the Fellowship arriving at Caras Galadhon, the heart of Lothlorien. They walk up the central stairs to meet Celeborn and Galadriel, the leaders of this kingdom. Upon arrival, Celeborn asks where Gandalf is, saying that he would much like to speak with him. Galadriel says that he has passed into shadow and she can no longer see him, and Legolas explains that he fell to both shadow and flame as a Balrog of Moria took him. He says that they went needlessly into the net of Moria, but Galadriel says that needless were none of the actions of Gandalf and that his story might not be over just yet. After this, she addresses Gimli, who is downcast and feels guilty that Gandalf fell in Moria. Plus, she eyes Boromir, who begins to cry as she telepathically communicates with him. Then Celeborn, saying that without Gandalf hope is lost, asks what will now become of the Fellowship. Galadriel steps in and says that hope is not lost and that they can rest in Lothlorien, but we also hear her telepathically speaking to Frodo as she creepily welcomes him in as one who has seen the Eye. The scene then cuts to the Fellowship getting ready to go to sleep, and Legolas tells them that the elves are singing a song of lament for Gandalf, but he doesn't have the heart to translate it for them. Sam then steps in and tries to make up a song about Gandalf's fireworks, but ultimately gives up. Aragorn then goes over to where Boromir is sitting in solitude and tells him to get some rest as the borders of Lothlorien are well guarded, but Boromir refuses and says that he will not sleep here. He tells Aragorn that Galadriel spoke to him about the fall of Gondor, but told him that there is hope. Boromir admits that he cannot see this hope, and clearly he is breaking down. He confides in Aragorn that although his father is a noble man, their people lose faith, and we get a glimpse of the true Boromir, feeling like he can't live up to the kingly expectations set upon him. They end their conversation on a positive note, as Boromir says that one day they will be welcomed back to Gondor. Finally, we cut to Frodo waking from his sleep and seeing Galadriel walking by. He follows her down to an area with a shallow silver basin that she pours water into, and she tells him that it is the Mirror of Galadriel, and to look inside it. When he does, he sees multiple visions, but ends with seeing the Eye of Sauron with the weight of the ring pulling him towards the basin. He falls backwards, and Galadriel then tells him that she has seen the Eye as well, and shows him her ring. Ultimately, Frodo offers the one ring to Galadriel, and she turns it down, but only after becoming Crazy Witch Lady. Then she says that she has passed the test, and she will now diminish and remain Galadriel. She ends their exchange by telling a doubtful Frodo that even the smallest person can change the course of the future, attempting to instill some hope in him. And that is the end of the scenes that we're analyzing today. Per usual, what is only a few minutes in the movie is an entire chapter for Tolkien, except this time it isn't just the description of trees or the sky that extends this chapter, but actually a chunky bit of dialogue that is removed from the films for time. There are several impactful plot changes that we'll cover today, but first we need to go over our character, timeline, and location differences. First, our character differences are quite simple, as there are no missing characters in the movie. Of course, there are many unnamed elves mentioned that are just present in Lothlorien, but the only notable characters we have are in both the movie and the book. These are obviously the Fellowship minus Gandalf, Celeborn, Haldir, and Galadriel. Next, our only location change is quite simple, as the book mentions them convening with Celeborn and Galadriel in a chamber high up inside a massive tree in Lothlorien. We'll go over the details of this event more in the plot changes, but just know for now that the movie shows the Fellowship simply standing on a platform high up in the tree, whereas the book describes a chamber with seats and a whole host of elves inside with Celeborn and Galadriel at the head of the seats. Next, the timeline is a little skewed here. Of course, the movie skips straight to them departing from Lothlorien without giving us any implication of a specific amount of time passing, but in the book we know that they're in Lothlorien for nearly a month. The movie makes it seem like they arrive in the evening, spend the night there, which is when Frodo meets with Galadriel, and then they leave immediately the next morning. I'm sure Peter Jackson would argue that they were there for a month, but they just didn't show it in the movie. However, I find that hard to believe. Even in the books, the moment we get with the Mirror of Galadriel doesn't happen until they've been there for a couple weeks. Again, I'll address more of this in the plot changes. And speaking of which, let's jump into those right now, as there are quite a few that we need to get through. Throughout these changes, I might throw some bits of context here and there, but I do want to preface this section by saying that I can't dive into every exchange of dialogue that they have in the book. This chapter is filled with dialogue, like a lot of it. So I know I might miss some random lines or quotes that you might find important, but if you want to know specifically the conversations that each character has, I would encourage you to just reread or re-listen to it yourself. Speaking of which, you can check the description for a free trial of Audible, which includes one free audiobook of your choice. So if you're dying to relive this moment and know specifically what is said, go sign up for Audible for free, get the Fellowship of the Ring audiobook, and follow along with me each week. Plus, each free trial supports the channel at the same time, so it's a win-win. Alright, let's get into the changes. First up, we have a change right from the get-go of this scene. The whole Fellowship does not go up to meet with Celeborn and Galadriel at once. This almost seems to be a Lothlorien elven custom or something, as you'll recall that Haldir did the same thing with Legolas and Frodo when he met them. Anyway, Haldir has Frodo go up with him first, and then after Frodo sits next to Celeborn by invitation, they welcome each member of the Fellowship one by one. As they arrive, each member takes a seat in this massive chamber that is carved into this tree. Next, after Galadriel asks where Gandalf is, she says that she much desired to speak with him. This line is given to Celeborn in the movie. Plus, it is not Legolas who replies, but actually Aragorn, saying that Gandalf fell in Moria. After this, the elves in the chamber all cry out in grief as they are completely astonished by this news and greatly saddened. This is further solidifying in the minds of the hobbits especially how important Gandalf was to not only the Shire, but the entirety of Middle-earth. Another change is that in the book, Celeborn is the one who says that they went needlessly into the net of Moria, not Legolas. This is a small moment in the movie in which they give the line to Legolas and then they show Gimli looking guilty and downcast on behalf of his dwarven kin. But in the book, this is a more extended moment in which Gimli begins to love the Lady Galadriel. You see, upon Gimli's arrival in the chamber, Celeborn says that he hopes elves and dwarves can once again become allies and friends. But then, once they reveal that Gandalf fell to a Balrog and that the Balrog is Durin's bane, Celeborn backtracks and says that if he had known the dwarves had awoken this evil before they got there, he would have never let Gimli or the others pass into their land. He almost chastises Gandalf and says that he fell out of wisdom into folly for his choice to go into Moria. This is then when Galadriel counters Celeborn's comment by saying that needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf. But she adds on to this that Celeborn should not retract his welcome of the dwarf Gimli, saying that the elves are not blameless and in past times had made similar mistakes as the dwarves. She adds that the halls of Khazad-dûm and the jewels of Moria are fair, and it is no wonder that the dwarf would want to go see them again. Gimli then looks upon her and feels love and stands up to bow while saying that Lorien and the Lady Galadriel are fairer than all the jewels beneath the earth. This is a crucial bit of context, as it further helps the reader understand why Gimli suddenly becomes so attached and protective of the Lady Galadriel throughout the rest of the trilogy. You can easily point back to this moment of Galadriel defending him in front of Celeborn as the moment that solidified his love for her. Next, Legolas doesn't mention the elves singing that first night, and Sam doesn't make up a song at this time, but later. This is a classic case of Peter Jackson just condensing the timeline to make it as compact as possible. For context, it is actually days later that Tolkien writes about the Fellowship speaking of Gandalf, and it is actually Frodo who makes up a song about him, which is pretty out of character for Frodo. It just goes to show how close Gandalf was to him that he would take the time to write a song about him. Only after Frodo shares his song with Sam does Sam say his lines about the fireworks. Also, they do eventually hear the elves singing their songs of lament about Gandalf, and Legolas does refuse to translate them, but this happens a few days into their stay in Lothlorien. So now we come to our first critical moment of character development for Boromir. In the movie, Boromir breaks down into tears when Galadriel stares at him, and he later speaks with Aragorn about what he saw. But there are several changes here. To give you some context, let me fill you in on what actually happens in the book when Galadriel speaks to them. You see, when Galadriel spoke to the entire Fellowship in the chamber, she took a moment to telepathically communicate with each member. It is revealed afterwards, when they are all preparing for sleep, that she had tested each of them individually by offering them something that they desired. This was a simple test she was using to see if they were loyal to the mission. Not all of them reveal what they were offered, but they all seem to agree that it was an uncomfortable experience. The first change in the movie is the conversation between Aragorn and Boromir. In the book, this never happens. In fact, as they are discussing this mental test that Galadriel put them through, Boromir insults Galadriel by saying that he doesn't trust her intentions. Aragorn takes offense to this and tells Boromir that the only evil in Lothlorien is the evil that a man brings with him. He then says that he's going to sleep, as this is the first night he will feel safe while resting. So the whole conversation of Boromir telling Aragorn what he saw and confiding in him doesn't happen. The second change about this moment is that when they are discussing the test, Boromir says that he obviously refused the offer, as the men of Minas Tirith are strong like that. But this comment is obviously him overcompensating for how he really feels. He then presses Frodo multiple times, asking him many questions, but Frodo refuses to answer him. The crucial bit of context here in regards to the test is that Boromir was the only one who was offered the ring. Whereas Frodo was offered a simple life away from trouble, and Sam was offered a garden of his own, Galadriel tempted Boromir with the vision of him using the ring to successfully defend Gondor and tear down Barad-dûr. And this seems to break Boromir officially. Previously, he had done a good job staying strong and following the Fellowship, but after this moment, we get the feeling that this vision of his greatest desire, which is defending Gondor and becoming a hero, pushes him over the edge of corruption and desire for the ring. You see, he didn't want the ring for himself, but saw it as a necessary tool and weapon, which is often the way that the ring would tempt you. And one has to wonder, would Boromir have stayed strong throughout the rest of the story if Galadriel wouldn't have shown him this vision? Did this test designed to solidify the company end up backfiring? Well, once you're done with this video, let me know what you think in the comments. But don't go there just yet, because we still have a few more changes, and we also need to address Sam's vision in the Mirror of Galadriel. So let's keep it moving with our next change. What we have just covered encapsulates the first night in Lothlorien, but as I mentioned, they end up staying there for about a month. Before we get into the changes to the moment of the Mirror of Galadriel, there's one small thing that I have to mention. So after the first night, Legolas ends up sleeping separately from them and spends a lot of time with his Lothlorien kin. He goes on patrol every day, but comes back to eat meals with the Fellowship. But the most interesting part is that Tolkien makes a point to note that Legolas takes Gimli with him. And Tolkien writes that the rest of the Fellowship finds this odd, but it showcases the beginning of their strong bond and friendship. It seems to come out of the blue, and we don't learn any more of these moments that they spend together on patrol, but obviously we see the fruit of this time spent together later, as they are much more loyal and friendly to one another from this point on. So finally, we come to the Mirror of Galadriel. There are a handful of changes between the book and this event in the movie, but the most notable is that Sam is with Frodo when this happens. Before Galadriel even shows up, Frodo and Sam are talking about the elves and Lorien and how it feels like a vacation and home at the same time. Sam mentions how the elves here are closer to hobbits than other elves they've seen. Lorien is very similar to the Shire in the sense that it is almost disconnected from the troubles of the outside world. Sam also mentions that he would have liked to see some more magic and thought that magic would be more obvious and common in a place like Lothlorien. He also mentions that they haven't seen the Lady Galadriel in a couple weeks. It is at this moment that Galadriel shows up and takes them to the mirror, which she says is what they would call magic. This freaks out the hobbits, as they literally were just talking about how they wanted to see Galadriel and magic, and now within minutes they're seeing both. Next, the visions they see in the mirror are completely different from what we get in the film. Sam goes up to the mirror first and sees Ted Sandyman cutting down trees. He begins yelling at him to stop, as Sam is a lover of everything that grows, and this is a cardinal sin in his eyes. He then sees the old mill in the Shire transform into a factory with smoke coming out of it, and Sam mentions that Elrond was right to want to send Merry and Pippin back to the Shire, because the the hobbits there need warned of this potential future. After stepping back from the mirror, he says that he must go home to stop the evil things happening in the Shire, but Galadriel says that he can't turn back. Sam seems to crumple to the ground and says that he wishes he had never come and says that he doesn't want to see any more magic. But then, with a sudden determination, he gets up and says that he'll take the long road home with Frodo or not at all. And he states that if what he's seen is true, then when he gets back to the Shire, someone's going to catch it hot. Obviously, we know as the readers that this vision is foreshadowing the scouring of the Shire, which I've mentioned a few times throughout this series. If you know anything about the scouring of the Shire, then you know Sam's statement is very true and he sort of is the one who saves the day. If you don't know what the scouring of the Shire is, then you're in for a treat once we get there in this series. But let's back up real quick and break down this moment with Sam. I think it is key to note this moment as a big turning point in Sam's mentality. I think for most of this journey so far, Sam has been going on this road with Frodo simply because he feels like he needs to be there for Frodo, almost not grasping the enormity of the situation in Middle-earth. And while this loyalty for Frodo is still an integral part of Sam's character, this vision that Sam has in the mirror is a defining moment for him as he suddenly becomes more determined than ever to accomplish the task. Not just for Frodo, but for the Shire. Seeing the evil that comes to even his far-off land seems to get through to Sam in a way that hasn't happened yet in the journey. This fight isn't just for the elves and men and dwarves, but it will eventually affect their land too. And when Sam says that he'll go home by the long road with Frodo, he's saying that he will go home, but only after they complete the task that they set out to do. And as we know, this steadfast mindset literally carries Frodo to the finish line by the end. Now, the last couple of changes are in regard to Frodo's vision. Obviously, he doesn't see the scouring of the Shire since that was Sam's vision. Instead, he sees a series of disconnected prophetic visions that will come up in the future of this series. He sees the White Wizard, which he thinks is Gandalf, but might be Saruman. He sees Bilbo pacing around a room, he sees a ship and the sea, and lastly he sees Minas Tirith in the battle on the Pelennor Fields. Lastly, the movie cuts out Galadriel and Frodo's dialogue about the rings. Like I said earlier, I can't go into details because it would take way too long, but to summarize, Frodo asks her why he can't perceive all 3 elven rings. And Galadriel says that it's because he hasn't tried. In order to do so, he would need to wield the One Ring from a position of power, which isn't in his nature. Although, he can see her ring because just from the few times of him wearing the One Ring, his eyes have grown keener. She asks Sam, who is standing behind them, if he can see her ring, and he says no, and that he only sees a star shining through her finger. And that wraps up all of the differences between this chapter of the book and its corresponding scenes in the movie. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so let me know what you think about Peter Jackson's interpretation of these events. Do you like the way that they portrayed Boromir's vision? Do you agree with their decision to remove Sam from the Mirror of Galadriel scene? Let me know down below. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.